The city of New York has two hearts, the one that beats for the world, and the one that bleeds in the shadows. Dante. The surgeon Falcone owned those shadows. He was a man of precise, cold calculations, a ghost who controlled empires from the velvet booth of a restaurant. But the air in La Sorte was always thick with the scent of old money, expensive wine, and unspoken fear. The Upper East Side restaurant was Dante Falcone's unofficial throne room. When he was present, dining in his preferred back booth, table 7, back to the wall, full view of both entrances, the clinking of cutlery softened, the laughter became brittle, and the staff moved with the precise, terrified grace of ballet dancers on broken glass. Dante Falcone did not earn the name the surgeon by being a brute. Brutes were messy, loud, and predictable. Dante was immaculate. He removed problems with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, leaving behind clean incisions, often in a rival's financial ledgers or political standing, long before he ever had to bloody his hands. His suits were bespoke, his gaze was arctic, and his patience was a legend. Isabella Rossi understood this atmosphere. She was a ghost of a different kind, a young woman trying to be invisible. She'd worked at La Sorte for 6 months, a job she'd fought for, a job that paid just enough to keep the wolves from the door of her tiny, crumbling Brooklyn apartment. She was good at her job. She was quiet, efficient, and never, ever made eye contact with the clientele at table 7. Tonight, however, the wolves were not just at the door. They were in her home, in her head. Her hand, the one holding the silver tray, was trembling, not just a slight tremor, but a visible, humiliating vibration. On the tray sat a single espresso corretto with a splash of grappa, Dante Falcone's nightly ritual. She approached the table, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. Dante wasn't looking at her. He was speaking in a low, measured tone to his consigliere, Julian Hayes, a man who looked more like a Wall Street analyst than a mob lawyer. "The shipping manifests are clean," Julian was saying, "but the weight is the issue," Dante murmured, not looking up. Isabella moved to place the small cup on the table. As she leaned forward, her starched white cuff, which she had painstakingly ironed to be extra stiff, snagged on the corner of the heavy linen napkin. The movement was tiny, but combined with her tremor, it was disastrous. The cup tilted. Hot espresso splashed onto the back of Dante's hand. The entire restaurant plunged into an abyss of silence. Julian Hayes froze, his mouth half open. The maître d' looked faint. Isabella's blood ran cold. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Falcone. She reached for a napkin, her movements jerky and panicked. But Dante's hand, the one she had just burned, shot out and clamped around her wrist. It wasn't a strike, but the grip was like steel. "Stop," he said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. She froze, utterly still, her eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking at his hand. He wasn't looking at the spilled espresso. He was looking at her wrist, where his grip had pinned the starched cuff. And just beneath the white fabric, peeking out onto the pale skin of her forearm, was the edge of a grotesque, mottled stain. A bloom of dark purple and sickly yellow, the unmistakable, thumb-shaped imprint of a violent grip. Isabella tried to pull away, a small, choked sound escaping her. This only tightened his hold. He held her fast, his eyes, the color of a winter ocean, lifting from the bruise to meet hers. The restaurant, the city, the world, seemed to shrink to the few inches between them. Dante Falcone, a man who never raised his voice, who never made a scene, slowly, deliberately, used his free thumb to push the starched cuff of her uniform sleeve an inch higher. The full extent of the injury was revealed. It wasn't one bruise, but a cluster of them, a chain of overlapping, finger-shaped marks that circled her slender wrist like a shackle. It was the mark of someone who had grabbed her, twisted her, and held on tight. Dante's indifference shattered, replaced by something dark and intensely focused. The air crackled. Julian Hayes carefully placed his pen on the table, sensing the shift. "I fell," Isabella stammered, the lie thin and pathetic. "I'm clumsy. I fell down the stairs at my apartment." Dante's gaze remained locked on the bruises. He watched the way she trembled, the way her eyes darted to everyone but him. He hated many things: disloyalty, inefficiency, and incompetence. But he truly despised disorder. And this crude, brutal artwork on his waitress's skin was the height of disorder. It was messy. It was the work of an animal. He finally released her wrist, and she snatched it back, pulling the sleeve down as if she'd been burned again. He leaned back in the booth, the moment of intensity passing, the cold mask sliding back into place. He calmly took a napkin and wiped the espresso from his hand, his movements unhurried. He looked at Julian. "Get the car." Julian nodded, rising silently and disappearing. Dante then looked back at Isabella, who was visibly shaking, convinced she was about to be fired, or worse. He gestured to the empty chair at his table. "Sit, Ms. Rossi." A command. Not a request. Patrons didn't sit with Mr. Falcone. Staff never sat with Mr. Falcone. She sat, her legs feeling like water. He didn't speak for a full minute, simply observing her. "The stairs," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "They must be very angry at you. Mr. Falcone, please, I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I can't lose this job." "I am not concerned about my suit," he interrupted, his voice clipped. He leaned forward, the faint scent of expensive cologne and the bite of the grappa washing over her. "I am a man who values precision. That bruise," he tapped his own wrist, "is not from a fall. That is the signature of a right-handed man, approximately 6 feet tall, who grabbed you to restrain you while he used his left hand for other things." Isabella's face went white. She felt exposed, as if he had just read the last 12 hours of her life from a script. "Who?" he asked. The single word hung in the air, heavier than a death sentence. "I can't," she whispered, tears welling. "You can," he countered, his voice softening, which was somehow more terrifying. "You can, because you are currently sitting at my table, in my restaurant, under my protection. The moment I saw that mark, you became my concern. And my concerns," he paused, "have a tendency to be resolved, permanently." She looked at his eyes, cold, clear, and offering no escape. She saw the truth there. He wasn't offering help. He was stating a fact. She took a ragged breath, the name tearing from her throat, a whisper of shame and terror. "Marco. His name is Marco Vieri." Dante Falcone nodded once, a small, final gesture. He placed a few $100 bills on the table, far more than enough for the bill. "Your shift is over, Isabella," he said, rising from the booth. "My driver will take you home. I can take the subway." That was not a suggestion. He walked away, not waiting for a reply. Isabella was left at the table, the entire restaurant staring at her, the woman who had spilled coffee on the surgeon and lived. She didn't know it yet, but home was no longer her rundown apartment, and her life, so small and desperate just minutes before, had just been irrevocably and terrifyingly acquired. The ride was silent. The car was a black, armored Mercedes, the kind that whispered of power rather than shouting it. The windows were so darkly tinted that the vibrant New York night blurred into streaks of abstract light. Isabella sat on the plush leather, feeling small and dreadfully out of place. The driver, a mountain of a man named Leo who hadn't spoken a word, navigated the streets with fluid, economical movements. She had given him her address in Brooklyn, but he didn't take the bridge. He headed uptown. "This isn't the way," she said, her voice small. "Mr. Falcone's orders," Leo replied, his voice a gravelly bass. "We're not going to your apartment." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "Where are we going? Please, I just want to go home." "We're going somewhere safe." The distinction was clear. Home was not safe. They arrived at a towering, pre-war building overlooking Central Park West. The doorman, dressed in a long burgundy coat, didn't even look at the car before waving it through the private wrought-iron gates into a secure courtyard. Leo opened her door. "The penthouse. Mr. Falcone is waiting." Isabella felt like she was dreaming. She was escorted by Leo into a private elevator, which opened directly into the most spectacular space she had ever seen. The penthouse was a two-story marvel of glass, steel, and old-world elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Central Park, a dark, sprawling rectangle glittering with the lights of the city beyond. The furniture was minimalist, but clearly priceless, and the walls were lined not with art, but with books, thousands of them, leather-bound and imposing. Dante Falcone was standing by the window, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He had changed from his suit into a simple, dark cashmere sweater and trousers, making him look less like a don and more like a scholar, which was somehow more disquieting. "This isn't my home," Isabella said, her voice trembling as she stood in the massive entryway. "It is for now," he replied, turning. "Drink?" "No, I want to know what's happening." "What's happening," Dante said, walking toward her, "is that I am handling a situation. You will stay here. You will be provided with clothing, food, anything you require. You will not leave without Leo. You will not contact anyone from your old life. Is that clear?" It was a cage, a beautiful gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. "You can't just take me. Marco, he'll what?" Dante's voice was dangerously quiet. "He will do nothing, because he is a problem. And he took a sip of his drink, "am a surgeon." He gestured to a spiral staircase. "Your room is upstairs. Get some rest. We will talk in the morning." He dismissed her with a nod, turning back to the window, the city lights reflecting in his glass. While Isabella was being installed in her luxurious prison, Julian Hayes was in his own office, a sleek, modern space in a midtown high-rise that served as the legitimate front for the Falcone empire. Julian wasn't a thug. He was a Yale-educated lawyer and a forensic accountant, the true scalpel in Dante's toolkit. He typed Marco Vieri into his system. The man who materialized on his screen was exactly the type Dante despised: small-time, arrogant, and sloppy. Vieri was a bartender at a high-end sports club, but his real income came from a modest bookmaking operation he ran out of the back room. He had a record: 2 minor assault charges, both plea-bargained down, both against women. He was a bully. But then Julian dug deeper. The database cross-referenced payments, territory maps, and whispered intel. And a new, much more dangerous name popped up. Marco Vieri's bookmaking operation wasn't his own. He was a collector, a bottom feeder taking a skim, but the territory itself belonged to the Valenti family, Silvio Valenti. Julian swore, leaning back in his chair. This just went from a simple pest control problem to a political incident. Silvio Valenti was the last of the old-school dons, loud, violent, and emotional. He and Dante Falcone held the city in a fragile truce, a cold war of mutually assured destruction. The Falcones controlled the ports and high finance. The Valentis ran the unions and the street-level gambling. And Marco Vieri, The man who had put his hands on Dante Falcone's new interest was a Valenti employee. Julian picked up his secure line. Dante answered on the first ring. "There's a complication," Julian said. "No preamble?" "The boyfriend. He's Valenti." The line was silent for a moment. Isabella, in the penthouse, could not have known that her fate was being discussed, that her abuser was not just a lone, pathetic monster, but the tentacle of a much larger one. "Does Valenti know Vieri is unprofessional?" Dante asked. "Doubtful. He's small fry, a collector. But he's on their payroll. If he disappears, Sylvia will take it as a message, a territorial move." "He is a territorial move," Dante said, his voice dropping. "He brought his filth into my establishment and marked property that was under my observation. He doesn't get to live just because he works for a pig." "Dante, a war over a bartender is sloppy. It's not your style." "It is not a war, Julian. It is an education. Find out why he did it. The girl, Isabella, she was terrified, but she was also ashamed. It was more than a beating. There's a why. Find it." "And Vieri?" Julian asked. "Don't touch him. Not yet. I want him to know why his life is ending. I want him to understand the architecture of his own destruction." Dante disconnected the call. He stood at the window, staring down at the park. A Valenti problem. This was interesting. It was an opportunity. But first, he needed to understand the asset he had just acquired. He walked upstairs. Isabella was huddled on the king-sized bed, still in her waitress uniform, looking at the city lights. She looked up as he entered, flinching. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "I don't like messes," he said, standing in the doorway. "And that man," he nodded toward her bruised wrist, "is a mess. You don't even know me. I know you've worked for me for 184 days. I know you've never been late. I know you order the staff meal, but rarely eat it. I know you send half your paycheck to a nursing home in Queens. And I know you've been wearing long sleeves, even on hot days, for the last 3 weeks. I know enough." Isabella stared at him, horrified and amazed by the totality of his observation. "Now," he said, stepping into the room, "you're going to tell me about Marco, not the beatings. I'm aware of those. You're going to tell me why you let him, why you stayed. What does he have on you, Isabella?" She recoiled. "It's not complicated. I specialize in complications." She finally broke. The story poured out of her, a torrent of shame. "My father. He was a gambler. He died last year. But he left debts, horrible debts. I was paying them off, I swear, but I missed a payment. Marco Vieri was the one who came to collect. He said the debt was his now. He said if I didn't pay, or if I didn't cooperate, he would go to the nursing home." "My mother," she was sobbing now. "She has Alzheimer's. She doesn't even know who I am. But he said he'd make her homeless. He said he'd hurt her. I had no choice." Dante stood very still, his face unreadable. He had found the why. Marco Vieri wasn't just an abuser, he was a parasite. "Who did your father owe, Isabella? Who holds the paper?" "I don't know the name, just the family, an old family, the Valentis." Dante's expression didn't change, but a cold, satisfied understanding settled in his eyes. This was perfect. This wasn't just a complication. It was leverage. He had just acquired Isabella Rossi, a waitress, and in doing so, he had just acquired her father's debt, a debt owed to his greatest rival. "Get some sleep, Isabella," he said, his voice softer now. "Marco Vieri will not be coming to the nursing home. He will not be coming anywhere, ever again." The next morning, Marco Vieri woke up with a pounding headache and a sense of unease. He'd been rough with Bella last night, rougher than usual. She hadn't been respectful. She'd cried when he'd taken her tips from the jar, and he'd had to remind her of the rules. She hadn't come home last night, which infuriated him. She was probably hiding at a friend's. He'd find her. He'd teach her another lesson. He reached for his phone to call his bookie. The line was dead. He checked his bank account app. Account frozen. Please contact your branch. A cold sweat prickled his forehead. He tried his credit card at the corner bodega. Declined. What the hell? He muttered. He walked back to his apartment, a mid-range condo he'd secured through his Valenti connections. There was a bright orange sticker on his door. Notice of emergency eviction. Hazardous substance. He ripped it off, his key fumbling in the lock. It wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. He heard movement inside. He banged on the door. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" The door opened. 2 uniformed NYPD officers stood there. Behind them, men in hazmat suits were bagging his possessions. "Sir, you need to step back," the first officer said, hand on his nightstick. "This is my apartment," Marco yelled. "Not anymore." The building manager received an anonymous tip. Found a significant black mold infestation in your unit's ventilation. Health code violation. Buildings voided your lease. You've got 2 minutes to be off the property before we arrest you for trespassing. Mold? What mold? This is crap. Tell it to the judge, pal. Get lost. Shoved back into the hallway, Marco was bewildered. His phone, his money, his home, all gone in the span of an hour. He was standing on the street in yesterday's clothes, a rising panic in his chest. He tried to think. He had to call his boss, the Valenti capo he reported to. He used a payphone. The number was disconnected. This was the work of Dante Falcone. The surgeon didn't send men with bats. He sent city inspectors, bankers, and telecom engineers. He cut a man off from the grid, severed his lifelines, and left him to bleed out in a world of paperwork and bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Isabella woke up in a room larger than her entire apartment. Sunlight streamed through the windows. A woman she hadn't met before, Mrs. Davies, a stern-looking housekeeper, had laid out an array of clothes on the bed. Soft silks, cashmere, and designer jeans. "Mr. Falcone has instructed that you are to be comfortable," Mrs. Davies said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "A car will be ready for you in an hour." "A car? Where am I going?" "To the Winslow Nursing Home in Queens. Visiting hours are at 11. Mr. Falcone has taken care of the outstanding balance. Your mother's account is now, and will remain, in good standing." Isabella sank onto the bed, the silk cool against her skin. The outstanding balance was tens of thousands of dollars. He'd just paid it. She thought of Marco's threats, the crushing weight of that debt, a weight she had carried every single day since her father died. And Dante had lifted it with a phone call. She was taken to the nursing home in the black Mercedes. Leah waited outside. She spent an hour with her mother, Maria, who held her hand and called her Anna, the name of her own sister. Isabella cried, but for the first time in years they were tears of relief, not terror. When she returned to the car, her resolve had hardened. She was a prisoner, yes, but one who had just been handed a lifeline. She was driven not to the penthouse, but back to La Sorte. The lunch rush was in full swing. Leo opened her door. "Mr. Falcone is expecting you. Table 7. She walked in. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress that had been among the clothes. Her hair was clean, and the bruises on her wrist were covered by a fine silver bracelet. The maitre d' didn't just greet her. He bowed his head. "Miss Rossi. This way." The entire staff, her former colleagues, stared as she was led to the Don's table. Dante was there, eating a tagliatelle al ragù. He looked up as she approached. "Isabella, join me." She sat. He gestured, and a waiter instantly appeared with a plate for her. "Your mother is well?" he asked. "Yes, thank you. What you did, I can't repay you." "I don't expect you to," Dante said, taking a sip of wine. "I told you. You are my concern. That debt is gone. But it belonged to the Valenti family. It does. Which is why," he continued, as if discussing the weather, "I will be repaying it on your father's behalf." Right on cue, the doors of La Sorte opened, but it wasn't a patron. It was Silvio Valenti, flanked by 2 bodyguards. The restaurant, which had been buzzing, fell silent. Valenti, a big, florid-faced man, scanned the room, his eyes landing on table 7. He saw Dante Falcone, and he saw the girl. His girl. The one whose father's debt he personally held. He stormed over to the table. "Falcone, what is the meaning of this? This creature is my property. Her old man owed me 50 grand. And her bartender, Vieri, he's one of my men. He's vanished." Dante slowly placed his fork on his plate. He looked up at Silvio, his expression one of mild boredom. "Silvio, you are shouting. In my restaurant, it's uncivilized." "I'll show you uncivilized, you prick. You poached my man, and you stole my collateral. You think you can just—" Dante held up a hand. The gesture was so absolute, so commanding, that Valenti actually stopped talking. "First," Dante said, his voice quiet but carrying, "your man, Vieri, was an animal. He used his hands on a woman. He brought his filth into my world. That is a violation of our understanding. I merely cleaned it up. His employment was terminated. Consider it a favor." "A favor? You disappear, my guy." "Second," Dante continued, ignoring him, "the debt. You are correct. Mr. Rossi owed you, and I, as a man of honor, always see that debts are paid." Dante nodded to Julian Hayes, who had been sitting at a nearby table. Julian stood up, holding a briefcase. He placed it on the table and opened it. It was filled with stacks of cash. $50,000, Dante said. "The principal, plus," Julian added, "another, smaller stack, 20%, for your inconvenience." Silvio Valenti was stunned into silence. He had come for a fight, for a war. He was being handed cash, in public, in front of La Sorte's clientele of judges, bankers, and socialites. "You're just paying it?" "I am," Dante said. "The debt is settled. Isabella Rossi is no longer your concern. She is my concern." This was the true incision. Dante hadn't started a war. He hadn't hidden. He had publicly and legally purchased Isabella from his rival. He had paid the bill. He had humiliated Silvio Valenti, treating him like a common creditor, not a rival don, while simultaneously removing one of his men from the board. Valenti's face turned a deep, apoplectic purple. He looked at the money, then at Dante, then at Isabella. He was trapped. To refuse the money would be to admit the debt was just leverage for abuse. To accept it was to admit defeat, to concede the girl to Falcone. He growled, snatching the money. His bodyguards closed the briefcase. "This isn't over, Falcone. You made a move. You broke the truce." "I settled a bill, Silvio," Dante corrected him. "You should be thanking me. Now please, you're letting a draft in." Silvio Valenti stared at him, his eyes promising murder. But he turned, and he left. He had lost. The restaurant slowly came back to life. Isabella was breathing hard. She looked at Dante. He had just bought her, as surely as if she were a painting at an auction. "Eat your pasta, Isabella," Dante said, picking up his fork. "It's getting cold." The whispers started before Silvio Valenti's car had even screeched away from the curb. The entire power structure of New York's underworld and a significant portion of its high society gossip columns vibrated with the news. Dante Falcone, the quiet, lethal, invisible Don, had publicly confronted his rival. not with guns, but with a briefcase full of cash. He had taken a nobody waitress, a girl with Valenti paper on her, and declared her his. This was the first act that shocked the city. It wasn't the violence. It was the lack of it. It was the audacity. It was a corporate takeover executed like a chess move. The New York Post ran a sly headline the next day. Soprano settles tab at La Sorte. Pays in cash. For Isabella, life became a surreal dream. The penthouse was her world. Mrs. Davies taught her which forks to use. Julian Hayes provided her with a new, secure phone and a line of credit. Leo, her silent shadow, drove her to museums, to libraries, to high-end boutiques on Fifth Avenue, where she was dressed in the armor of the elite. Chanel, Dior, Armani. Dante was an enigma. He was often absent, handling his vast, complex empire. But when he was home, the penthouse was charged with his presence. He would sit in his library, listening to vinyl records of complex, melancholic classical music, Mahler, Chopin. He would read or simply watch her. He never touched her. He never raised his voice. He asked her questions about the books she was reading. He had insisted she educate herself, about her mother, about her day. He was, in every way, a perfect gentleman, and it terrified her more than Marco's rage ever had. Marco's rage was predictable. This was control. This was possession, absolute and refined. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of gratitude, debt, and a deep, unspoken fear of the man who had saved her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one night. They were on the terrace, the city lights a carpet of diamonds below them. "I told you," he said, not looking at her, his eyes on the skyline. "I dislike disorder. You were a piece that was out of place. Now you are not. I'm a piece, a chess piece." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the city's glow. "We are all pieces, Isabella. The difference is whether you are playing the game or being played. You were being played. Now you are on my side of the board." A week after the incident at La Sorte, Dante made his second move. The annual Metropolitan Preservation Ball was the pinnacle of New York society, an event where old money families mingled with the new money titans of tech, and more discreetly, the patrons who held the city's real power. Dante Falcone always bought a table, and it always sat empty. A donation, a show of quiet power. This year he attended. When he walked in, a hush fell over the grand ballroom. He was dressed in a flawless tuxedo, a spectre of impossible elegance and menace. And on his arm, draped in a simple, floor-length gown of emerald green silk, was Isabella Rossi. She was unrecognizable from the terrified waitress. Her hair was styled, her face luminous, and the silver bracelet he had given her was her only jewelry, covering the last of the fading bruises. But it was her eyes that held the room, wide, alert, and carrying the unmistakable shadow of the man whose arm she held. This was the second shock. He wasn't just protecting her, he was presenting her. He was parading his new acquisition in front of the world. He introduced her to senators, to bank CEOs, to old money matriarchs. "This is Isabella Rossi," he would say, his voice smooth and proprietary. "She is a very dear friend." Everyone understood the subtext. She is mine. She is untouchable. Silvio Valenti was there, across the ballroom. He watched, his face a mask of thunder. Dante had not only taken his asset and his man, he was now flaunting the spoils in the one place Valenti craved but could never truly enter. Legitimate society. A slimy, ambitious city councilman named Peterson, who was deep in Valenti's pocket, saw an opportunity to curry favor. He approached Dante and Isabella, a champagne flute in his hand. "Mr. Falcone," Peterson slurred slightly, "A pleasure. And you, my dear?" He looked Isabella up and down, a leering, assessing gaze. "I don't believe we've met. You're new." "This is Isabella Rossi," Dante said, his voice flat. "Rossi. Rossi. Ah, yes, I heard a story about you. From La Sorte, aren't you? Waitress?" He was being deliberately insulting. Quite the come-up. Isabella flushed, her hand tightening on Dante's arm. Dante smiled. It was a thin, reptilian gesture that did not reach his eyes. "Councilman Peterson, so good of you to speak to us. I was just discussing the new zoning bill for the West Side docks." Peterson paled. The bill was his baby, and it was deeply corrupt, designed to funnel contracts to Valenti-owned construction firms. "I'm not sure this is the place," Peterson stammered. "I think it's the perfect place," Dante said, his voice a pleasant whisper, though Isabella felt his arm tense. "I've just seen the preliminary environmental impact reports, the ones your office didn't file, the ones that detail the toxic soil contamination, the one that, if it were to be, say, leaked to the Times, would not only kill your bill, but likely end your career. And that's before the federal investigation into the bidding process." Councilman Peterson was as white as the tablecloths. "Now," Dante continued, his smile still fixed, "you were saying something to Miss Rossi? About her come up?" Peterson's eyes darted from Dante's cold, knowing gaze to Isabella's face. He suddenly looked at her as if she were Medusa. He raised his hands, shaking. "No, nothing. A misunderstanding. A pleasure to meet you, Miss Rossi. Mr. Falcone." He practically ran, disappearing into the crowd. Isabella looked up at Dante. He hadn't threatened the man. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply cut him apart, with information. "You ruined him. In 30 seconds, she whispered. "He was rude to you," Dante replied, as if that were the only explanation necessary. He steered her toward the terrace. "He insulted what is mine." The entire ballroom had watched the exchange. They had seen the councilman's panicked retreat. The message was clear. The waitress was not just a passing fancy. She was a Falcone. To insult her was to insult him. This was the public declaration. Dante Falcone, the surgeon, had taken a pawn, placed her on the back rank, and declared her a queen. And he had just dared the entire city to try and take her. The city was braced for war. The gossip columns, the police precincts, the rival families. Everyone expected the streets to run red. Silvio Valenti had been publicly humiliated, first by having his debt bought out, and second by having his political pawn neutered at the city's most high-profile event. The old rules demanded blood. A drive-by, a car bomb, a hit on a key Falcone lieutenant. The city held its breath, waiting for the surgeon to be pulled into a messy, bloody street fight. The reprisal came, but it was not what anyone expected. It began 3 days after the ball. The Valenti family's primary source of liquid income was their control of the Longshoremen's Union at the Red Hook shipping terminal. It was their cash cow, the place from which they ran their gambling, loan sharking, and smuggling operations. On a Tuesday morning, a fleet of black sedans rolled up to the terminal. They weren't filled with Falcone hitmen. They were filled with agents from the Department of Labor, the IRS, and the FBI. An anonymous and incredibly detailed tip had been delivered to the U.S. Attorney's office. It contained decades of Valenti ledgers, offshore account numbers, and recordings. It detailed ghost employees, extortion rackets, and kickbacks, all implicating Silvio Valenti and his top capos. It was a systematic, digital assassination. Simultaneously, the New York Times, not the Post, but the Times, ran a Pulitzer-worthy expose on union corruption and its links to organized crime, complete with photocopied documents and timelines. The source, of course, was anonymous. By noon, Silvio Valenti's entire operation was frozen. His key men were in federal custody, his accounts were seized, and his political allies, like Councilman Peterson, were publicly disavowing him. This was what truly shocked the city. Dante Falcone hadn't sent a single soldier. He hadn't fired a single bullet. He had wielded the federal government like a personal scalpel, and, in the span of 3 hours, had surgically removed the Valenti family from the map. He had ended a decades-long rivalry without a drop of blood being spilled on the street. It was terrifying. It was surgical. It was an act of a modern god, not a gutter king. The underworld was aghast. The old ways were dead. Dante Falcone had rewritten the rules of engagement. While the city reeled, Isabella's life in the penthouse continued. She was reading The Count of Monte Cristo, a book Dante had left on her nightstand. She was beginning to understand him. He was a man of immense, suffocating patience, a man who understood that revenge is a dish best served cold, and, if possible, with a federal warrant. But a new tension was growing between them. The lines of their arrangement were blurring. He was her protector, her captor, her employer, her benefactor. The fear she felt was still present, but it was now threaded with a complex gratitude and a confusing, dangerous flicker of curiosity. She found herself watching him, watching the way his hands, so capable of destruction, turned the page of a rare book, watching the way he would listen, truly listen, when she spoke of her mother. He was a monster, she knew. He had destroyed lives. He had ended Marco Vieri. Julian had confirmed, in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, that Mr. Vieri had opted for an early retirement in a country with no extradition and would never be heard from again. But he was a monster who had saved her. One evening, he came home late. She had waited up, something she had started doing without being asked. He looked tired, the iron control he normally held seemingly frayed. He loosened his tie, a rare sign of vulnerability. "The Valenti family, it's over," she said, more a statement than a question. The news was everywhere. "It is," he said, pouring himself a drink. "You did that. With paper. Paper cuts deeper than steel, and it leaves a trail that leads everywhere but to me." He looked at her. "Are you afraid of me, Isabella?" The question hung in the air. She thought of Marco's hot, clumsy rage. She thought of the cold panic of her debt. She thought of the councilman's leering face. All of it was gone. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest answer she could give. "I'm afraid of you, but I'm not afraid with you. I feel safe," he supplied. "Yes." The word felt like a betrayal. He stepped closer, standing in front of her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, not to her wrist, but to her face. His thumb, the same one that had pushed back her sleeve to reveal her shame, now traced the line of her jaw. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. She didn't flinch. "You are safe," he murmured, his voice low and intense. "No one will ever put their hands on you again. No one will ever look at you the way that pig Peterson did. No one will ever harm you. Because you are mine, Isabella. You were mine from the moment I saw that bruise. You just didn't know it yet." He leaned in, and his mouth covered hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was not soft. It was a declaration. It was possession. It was all the cold calculation, all the dark, patient power he possessed, focused into a single devastating act. It was the final stamp of ownership. And the most terrifying part of all, the twist that would define the rest of her life, was that Isabella, shaking and overwhelmed, kissed him back. She was no longer just his concern. She was his. and in that moment she realized she had been waiting for it. The surgeon had made his final, precise cut, excising her old life completely and suturing her to his forever. The city settled into a new, nervous equilibrium. The Falcone Empire, having absorbed the Valenti territories without a fight, was more powerful than ever, and Bella Falcone, as the papers had unofficially dubbed her, became a fixture at Dante's side. She was his shadow, a symbol of his new, untouchable power. Isabella herself was trapped in a paradox. She lived in opulent safety. Dante was a demanding, possessive, and often cold partner, but he was not cruel. He was attentive. He discussed his business with her, not the dark mechanics, but the strategies, the corporate maneuvers. He valued her intelligence. He was, in his own way, molding her. But the ghost of her past was not as buried as she believed. Julian Hayes approached Dante one evening. His face, usually so placid, was troubled. "We have a problem," Julian said, handing Dante a tablet. "A ghost." "I don't believe in ghosts," Dante said. "You might believe in this one. It's Marco Vieri." Dante's eyes narrowed. "Vieri is gone. I financed his new life in the Cayman Islands myself. He is a non-entity." "He was," Julian corrected. "He was spotted at JFK this morning, using a fake passport. A good one. He slipped customs. He's back in New York. And—" Julian's face was grim. "We've intercepted chatter. He's not here for money. He's here for her. He's telling anyone who will listen that you stole his woman, and he's going to get her back. He's unhinged, Dante. He's not rational." Dante's stillness was absolute. This was a violation of his core principle, disorder. A problem he had solved had unsolved itself. "Where is Isabella?" "She's at the Frick with Leo. She wanted to see the Holbein exhibit." "Contact Leo. Bring her back, now. And find Vieri. I want him." "Dante," Julian said. "He's not Valenti. He's not a corporation. He's a rat with nothing to lose. He's unpredictable. Find him." At the Frick Museum, Isabella was standing in front of a portrait, Leo a discreet 10 feet behind her. Her new life was quiet, but she missed the simplicity of her old one. She missed anonymity. Her secure phone buzzed. It was Leo. "Ms. Rossi, we have to leave. Now." She turned, confused. "What? Why?" Leo was already moving, his hand inside his jacket. "We have a situation. Please walk quickly to the exit." As they moved through the marbled hall, a man stepped out from behind a tapestry. He was thin, his eyes manic, his face gaunt and scarred by a new desperation. It was Marco. Isabella froze, a gasp choking in her throat. He looked like a feral animal. "Bella!" he hissed, pulling a small, snub-nosed revolver from his waistband. The few other patrons screamed. Leo reacted instantly. He shoved Isabella behind his own massive body, drawing his own weapon. "Get down! Get out of here, Marco! You don't want to do this!" "He stole you!" Marco screamed, his voice cracking. "You were mine! He thinks he can buy everything. He thinks he can just erase me." "He did erase you, you idiot!" Leo growled, trying to edge Isabella toward the door. But Marco wasn't aiming at Leo. He was aiming at her. He knew he was a dead man. He just wanted to take his property with him. He fired. Leo lunged, pushing Isabella to the ground. The bullet, meant for her heart, tore through Leo's shoulder. He grunted in pain, but didn't fall, returning fire. Pop, pop. Marco staggered back, looking down at the 2 red blossoms on his chest. He looked at Isabella, his eyes wide with a final, pathetic confusion. Then he collapsed. The gallery was chaos. People were screaming. Leo was on one knee, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers, his gun still trained on Marco's body. Isabella was on the floor, her ears ringing, staring at the man who had been the source of all her fear. He was dead. Truly. Finally dead. And she felt nothing. No grief, no relief. Just cold. Then she saw Leo. "Leo, you're shot." "It's fine, Ms. Rossi," he gritted out, his training kicking in. "We need to move." When they got back to the penthouse, Dante was waiting in the lobby. He saw Isabella, pale but unharmed. Then he saw Leo, his arm in a makeshift sling, his jacket stained dark. Dante's face became a mask of cold fury. He walked past Isabella to his man. "How bad?" "Through and through. I'll live, boss." Dante nodded. He turned to Isabella. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't comfort her. He simply walked to her, took her chin in his hand, and tilted her head left and right, checking for any injury. His touch was clinical. "He's dead," she whispered. "Leo killed him." "Good," Dante said. He released her. "Julian, get Dr. Abramson up here for Leo, and call our friends at the 19th Precinct. The story is a foiled robbery at the museum. Leo is a hero. Ensure he gets a commendation. Mrs. Davies," he called to the housekeeper. "Get Ms. Rossi a brandy." He handled the entire incident with the detached efficiency of a CEO handling a supply chain disruption. Isabella watched him, her heart pounding. The shock was finally wearing off, replaced by a chilling realization. He wasn't angry that she had been endangered. He was furious that his security had been breached. He was enraged that a problem he had dealt with had dared to return. She followed him into the library. "You knew," she said. "You knew he was back." "We were aware of a potential threat," Dante said, pouring himself a drink. "You let me walk into that. You were with my best man," he said, his voice sharp. "The situation was handled. It is over." "He tried to kill me," she finally screamed, the terror and adrenaline breaking through. "He was there. He—" Dante slammed his glass down on the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "And he is gone!" Dante roared, the first time she had ever heard him raise his voice. The cold control shattered, revealing the volcanic rage beneath. "He is a stain that I have, at last, wiped clean. He dared to come back. He dared to touch what is mine." He strode toward her, backing her against the bookshelf. He was a terrifying, dominant force. "Do you understand me, Isabella? The why doesn't matter. The how doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that he is gone, and you are here. You are safe. Because I say you are safe." He was breathing heavily, his eyes blazing. She saw in him, in that moment, the unchained monster that had dismantled the Valenti family, the man who had ordered Marco Vieri to be erased, the true surgeon. She was terrified, but she didn't look away. "You're right," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "He is gone, and I am here." Her defiance, her stillness in the face of his rage, seemed to break the spell. He stared at her, the anger receding, replaced by a dark, possessive admiration. "Good," he said, his voice returning to its normal, low cadence. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Now, go and let Mrs. Davies look after you. This business is finished." Isabella walked out of the library, her legs weak. She had survived Marco Vieri. She had survived the Valenti family. And now, she had just survived Dante Falcone. She was realizing, with a cold, sinking dread, that the first two were simple beasts. The last one, the one she was tied to, was a different creature entirely. And she was trapped in his orbit, for good. Marco Vieri's failed attack was the final tremor. The city understood. Isabella Rossi was untouchable. But the incident changed Isabella. The terrified waitress was gone, replaced by a colder, harder woman forged in Dante's image. She was no longer just a resident of his penthouse. She was a student of his empire. She began analyzing his ledgers, questioning Julian Hayes about logistics and shell corporations. One night, she presented Dante with an analysis. "The Red Hook ports you acquired," she stated, "are bleeding money. Your hauler logistics are redundant. If you consolidate the contracts," she outlined a ruthless plan, "you'll increase profits by 8% and gain full control." Dante stared at her, a genuine, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "Julian," he called, "Ms. Rossi has just found a disorder." She became his apprentice, his partner. This was the move that truly shocked the city. It wasn't the violence, it was her ascension. The final proof came at the commission meeting at La Sorte. The collected bosses, old-world traditionalists, were appalled to see Isabella seated at Dante's right. "This is our business," a Chicago boss snarled. "Not for women." Dante merely smiled. "You are mistaken. You run operations. I run a corporation. This," he gestured to Isabella, "is my new COO. In fact, Ms. Rossi, perhaps you'd like to begin. I believe you have notes on the Chicago port's inefficiencies." The bosses sat in stunned silence as Isabella, cold, poised, and armed with data, began to clinically dissect the Chicago boss's own operation. Dante leaned back. He hadn't just saved the girl from the monster. He had shown her how to become one. The city never forgot the year the surgeon rewrote the rules. It started with a tremor of fear in a restaurant and ended with a new queen on the underworld's throne. Dante Falcone's greatest move wasn't a hit. It was an acquisition. He saw a flicker of steel beneath the bruises of a simple waitress and forged it into a weapon as precise and deadly as himself. The city was shocked, not by the blood he spilled, but by the empire he built in silence, proving that the greatest power isn't in the gun, but in the hand that moves the pieces. And now, two hands were moving them as one.